All right, so good afternoon or good morning, everybody. Thank you all for joining us today. I accidentally closed the presentation right when we're about to start, so oops. Let me fix that. I want to thank you all for joining us today for our monthly Master Gardener program. From current slide, I'm having issues on here. I do apologize. I hit one button and everything closes. Okay, we should we should be okay now. I apologize for that. But anyways, I want to thank you all for joining us today for our Master Gardener lecture series for Landscape Matters. And today we're going to be talking about roses, for the love of roses, understanding their history and care. One of our Master Gardener volunteers, Babs, was supposed to be presenting today, but she's getting over a sickness. And luckily she's doing much better, which is great, but it just means that we're going to end up having, I'm going to be doing the presentation in lieu of her. So I do appreciate her taking that time and opportunity to put this presentation together today. But anyways, for the love of roses, so we want to really understand, like, roses are an integral part to so many parts of our gardens and our landscapes that we want to make sure that we have the ability to successfully grow them. I know a lot of our Master Gardener volunteers really love growing roses, as well as a lot of the community members really like roses as well. And the reason we want to start talking about roses right now is just because so much of the maintenance really starts to kick off in February, just in time for Valentine's Day. So we want to make sure that we get that knowledge and that information out to everybody, as just because it's prudent and it's relevant to what we should be doing within our garden or prepare to do within our garden. So I want to kick off today's program by saying, like, why roses? And I really like this quote that Babs put in here. It says, roses, the world's most recognizable and romantic flower, has grown to represent much more than vibrant shades and intricate blossoms. Thanks to literature and its many references to the rose, the beautiful bloom and its accompanying thorns have come to represent hope, life, and of course, love. But did you know, I'm like, did you know that it's not actually a thorn? It's like every rose has its thorn. No, it doesn't. They have prickles. And I think this is important. I don't necessarily important, but it's a fact that I like to share. It's because there's different types of ways that plants create these different defense mechanisms. And with a rose, it's not actually a thorn. Botanically, that's incorrect. It is a prickle. So a prickle has the ability to, it's a sharp outgrowth that actually forms anywhere kind of like on the epidermis or the bark of a plant or a tree, a shrub, whatever it might be. And a thorn is actually a modified stem. So it's a stiff woody part of a stem that's located at those specific nodes. And you can see that in the image on the bottom. The thorn is on image A, that one on the left. And a spine is a stiff woody modified leaf locating at the nodes. So you can see in image B. So every rose has a prickle, not necessarily, it doesn't have a thorn. And we can actually see sometimes that thorns will produce way more prickles than you might be used to. And sometimes that can actually be a stress response. So seeing roses when they get covered in a lot of different prickles, way more than normal, it might be something worth investigating and looking at. But anyways, I always like to bring that up when talking about roses, is understanding these botanical terminologies, including the prickle, thorn, and spine. There is a difference. So, when talking about these, I always think about cacti as well. So a cactus, they're covered in all those different spines. So those are actually modified leaves. That's how cacti have evolved in such a way to help protect all that moisture on the inside of the herbaceous material. They store all that moisture, and those leaves have evolved in such a way where it's now just spines to help protect from from birds and animals and other things from getting in there munching and trying to eat all the goodies out. But anyways, so there is a difference. So every rose has a prickle. So why roses? Continue on. So I want to ask you all, and you can put this in the chat box. If you're on the computer or if you're at the library, you can maybe think out loud. But why roses? What interests you about roses? Is it the fragrance, the beauty, the place and how it looks in the garden? So that aesthetics in that context, is it literature driven? So is it all the above? Put your thoughts in the chat box. Yeah, the looks. Yeah, all the above. Yeah. Oh, especially the smell. Yeah, the fragrance. Oh, there's a lot of the all the aboves. The fragrance, the beauty. Yeah. Whoops. I can turn that off. I see that annotation is on. Whoop. I'll clear that. Um, okay. So, yeah, there's all these different reasons that we really like them. So, years ago, when I used to work at Kentucky State Botanical Gardens, we had this ginormous rose garden. Oh my gosh, it was beautiful. Um, and what we did was we'd have to maintain them, of course, but just like the smells, the colors, it like all of it, it was such a really, really cool place to hang out and be. So I've had my share of managing a lot of roses. It was a lot of fun. Except for pruning time of year, because that was a lot to do. But anyways, so roses have a certain appeal, and everybody's attracted to them for certain reasons, whether it be that color, that beauty, that fragrance, whatever it might be. We do that in such a way, well, that helps us in that decision making. What kind of roses may work best for our gardens? Because not only do we want to have them in our landscape because of their value, their aesthetic value, but we also want to make sure that we put them in a landscape where they can be successful. That successful selection of roses will allow them to be more resilient in your landscapes, especially for Florida gardens and yards, just because Florida's humidity and temperatures aren't known to be the best for roses. So that does have a significant role in our selection process. So anyway, so let's carry on. And there was a question about the chat again. You can only message directly to me. That's just more of a security protocol that we set up. So if you're not seeing what other people write, that's done with intent. But anyways, so how do we succeed with roses? What roses do best in Florida's environment? And then how do we manage roses in our landscapes? So we're going to talk about some of like the basic classifications of roses. Because a lot of it's based off of just like time and cultivation. And then we're going to really talk about management, because managing Florida's roses is difficult. Have any of you ever had any difficulty managing roses in the landscape? You can put some of those things in the chat box and I can let everyone know kind of what was being said. But what are some of the biggest issues for those that are managing roses? What are some of the biggest issues you've experienced? Pruning. Yeah. Aphids. Exactly. Yeah. There's a lot of different things. Yeah, I saw a lot of it. So keeping them alive. And one of the things that we're going to talk about is um, black spot. Black spot, like what we see in this image, is one of our biggest things that we have to deal with managing our roses. So um yeah, drift roses and knockout roses are commonly used in the landscape just because they're a little bit hardier and tougher. Um, but they don't always, to me, have the same aesthetic quality as some of our other roses. So yeah, there's a lot of great things that kind of popped up in here. So wonderful. So let's talk a little bit about rose classification. So rose classification, we kind of look at it in like these three major different categories. So we have our wild species, our old garden roses, as well as our modern rose. So our species, so like the wild roses, so those actually are the roses that are kind of just like our native natural roses that we'll have, that they lack that crossbreeding and hybridization of modern varieties just because roses are highly cultivated. So we're kind of looking at, these are the original roses. These are the ones that we see that occur naturally in their native environments. So and then the old garden roses, that's when we started. We also call them like the heritage rose or antique roses. Those essentially are any of the cultivated roses that exist prior to 1867. And then, and a lot of it has to do with like the horticulture trade and trading. And then we start to see a very big explosion in cultivation around that time of 1867. And that's kind of developed that period of that modern rose. So to cover every single rose available in this presentation today would be absolutely impossible. But our goal is to kind of just talk about some of the major, or some of the common roses that do well in Florida, just to kind of give you some ideas of things that you can grow. But anyways, we look at roses. We have our wild, our old garden, and our modern roses. So looking at some of our modern roses, there's different ones that we can have within our landscape. So there's like the hybrid teas and grandifloras. We have the miniatures and mini floras. Climbers. So climbers are some of the ones that you can end up like trellising, etc. Floribundas and polyanthas, and as well as we have some shrub forms of our modern roses. But anyways, some of the two that we commonly see grow really well, some examples are La France rose, which is a hybrid tea. But it is considered like the first hybrid tea rose, and it was introduced in 1867. And then the Cinco de Mayo, yeah, someone in chat box says that one does really well for them. That Floribundas, I believe it's the Floribundas do really well in Florida. They can tolerate that heat a little bit better. And Cinco de Mayo is one of those species. So that was created back in the 1930s, 1939. So let's talk about those best roses for Florida. So some of the things that we need to consider, because Florida, well, is a unique spot when it comes to gardening and landscaping. So some of the things we need to consider include like our soil type, our climate, as well as pest problems or pest pressures. So let's look at it based kind of like on maintenance level. So when it comes to low maintenance, our shrub roses or some of our old garden roses can have the lower maintenance. The higher maintenance might end up being the hybrid teas, floribundas, the polycantha, and that's just as a result of the need for like grooming, such as like the pruning practices, spraying fungicides, fertilizing, etc. So it's just a lot of inputs can end up going into those. Some really good common examples of some old garden roses that do well in Florida are the Mrs. B.R. Cant. So it has like a medium pink 3 to 5 inch double blooms, and the Louis Philippe. Yeah, both of these are super easy. Yeah, so I know some of our master gardeners grow the Louis Philippe, and they're like, "Oh yeah, it's great." So, but we have the B.R. Cant. It has some susceptibility to black spot and cercospora, but it has low susceptibility to chili thrips. And we will talk more about these diseases, after we do the introduction of these roses or some of the common rose problems and maintenance. So the Louis Philippe old garden rose has 2 to 3 inch double blooms, which is wonderful. A great fragrance. It can grow up to 7 feet tall. And here's a couple photos of those blooms. And I really like the BR Cant because I'm a huge fan of like peonies, those double bloom camellias, etc. So I really like those tight clusters of blooms, and I like that with the BR Cant a little bit more. But these are both pretty common, easy roses that you can grow. So the Mrs. BR Cant, that hybrid tea, old garden rose, and Louis Philippe. So some other ones that do really well include the mutabilis, which is a really cool one because it changes color. So it's yellowing and it can yellow and it changes like the pinks and reds. It's also called or referred to as the butterfly rose, and it is pretty resistant to pests, and it has a high heat tolerance. I don't know if it is the rose that has like the most heat tolerant for Florida, but it does have that high tolerance, which is great. Another one is a spice rose. So it is susceptible to black spot and cercospora, but it's pretty tough. It can get damaged, but with recovery, it can withstand that storm pretty well. And it does tolerate heat and humidity pretty well, but it's brought in from Europe to Bermuda as that part of that cultivation, and kind of it ended up its way within the horticulture trade. So here's some photos of it. So the mutabilis, again, it's a really cool old garden rose, because as the flower matures, it can get that changing color. It's kind of like the Confederate rose, similar to where you'll see it change colors. And then the spice rose, you can see it's got kind of more like that creamy white color to it, but it has a really cool peppery fragrance. A little bit different than other roses, but it kind of lends to its name, that common name of that spice rose. All right, so those are some of the common roses that we can grow here. I know this isn't an exhaustive list, but it is just a quick list, and we'll send you a list of more things that you can grow, of course. But I want to ask everybody, are there any examples of some other roses that you've had success with that you maybe like to share with others? And I'll make sure I can read that out. Yeah, peace roses. Lady Banks rose. I've heard about that one. Florida's native swamp rose. Yeah. Sweet spirits. Yeah, those are some great examples. But anyway, so now let's talk a little about site selection and preparation. Because of all of our gardening that we do in Florida in the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program, our biggest thing is right plant, right place. If you start with right plant, right place, and understand the environmental conditions that plants naturally thrive in, we can make sure that those plants are either selected for our site. So if we have a deep shade or a bright sun location, we're selecting plants that'll do well in those locations. So if we want to make sure we give our roses the best chance in their landscape, we need to start thinking about what are those environmental conditions that will allow them to be successful. Because anytime we start to depart from those preferred environmental conditions, that's when the plants start to get stressed. And that's what brings on more disease, more pathogens, more pests, such as insects, and it just doesn't thrive as well. But anyways, so let's talk about some of those conditions that roses do prefer. They prefer the 6 to 8 hours of sun. If part shade, it just needs to at least have morning sun and it can be successful. But we just like to make sure that they have full sun. That would be most preferred. Competition. If they're planted too close, you will definitely know that they start to get scraggly, they start to get leggy, and you start to have issues with it. But anyways, so it doesn't like that competition. They do have poor salt tolerance. So you really need to be aware of where you live in Nassau County. Like if you're on Amelia Island, you can definitely grow roses, but you just need to be aware that if we end up having a big storm come in, or if there's a lot of coastal breeze that might have some aerosol spray with it, that can cause some damage to those roses. So we just need to be cognizant that they don't like that salt. So therefore, we just need to be aware that it can have that issue. So they also prefer slightly acidic soils. So, 7 is our neutral for our soil pH. So anything less than 7, so a 6.5 is great. A 6.5 pH is ideal for a lot of our plants, including roses. If we start to have more of an alkaline soil, so anything higher than 7, you will actually start to see some stress on those roses. They'll usually start to look chlorotic, and a lot of it has to do with because they're having problems uptaking iron from the soil. And if you do have questions about your soil pH, you can actually bring samples to our extension office, and we do soil pH tests in our office, and we can actually give different recommendations on how to try to correct the soil, if you do need to make corrections, of course. So the great question just came in. Someone in the chat box did mention that they live right across the street from Main Beach. So does that mean this area might not be the best for roses in regards to salt? I would say plant them. Why not? That's usually in that situation. But if possible, it would be best if you had it like, think of your house or your property being a buffer to the aerosol spray. So if making sure that the rose is probably on the land side, or making sure the house is between the ocean and where you're planting the rose might help try to kind of create a buffer. So and if all else fails, always putting roses into containers can be successful, and it'll give you the ability to move them around if possible. So try to find that ideal spot. But anyways, great question. So going on, they prefer that slightly acidic soil, so you can do that soil pH test in our office, but they also prefer well-drained soils. So having that well-drained soils, because they love having water, but they don't like having their feet wet. So it's just important to know that if your soil's holding a lot of water, it doesn't drain naturally, then the rose may not be the best spot in the ground right there. So needs to have well-drained soils, because it's still going to need that moisture and get access to the nutrients. But if it doesn't drain well, you're going to end up having root issues with your rose. So again, for site selection, think about full sun, limit competition. They do have poor salt tolerance, so just being aware that you might have to protect it a little bit, or just where you're siting it in your property is going to be important. It prefers that slightly acidic soils, and you need those well-drained soils as well. So some other things that you can do as part of site preparation, if you do have a really, really well-drained soil, so just sand in a lot of our areas, you can till in some organic compost matter in those areas that you're starting to plant in. Not necessarily dig a hole and then backfill it with compost, but if you just till and amend the bed before you do planting, that can help give your roses and other plants kind of a good little boost. But if you do have poorly drained soils, you can try just tilling in sand in the top 12 inches of the soil, just to help improve drainage. Or you can just move them in containers or other raised beds where you have much more control over soil drainage. So let's talk about planting. So the best time to plant is going to be the early spring. And there are some discussions like what's going to be most preferred. Is it going to be bare root versus a container? So preferred just container grown is the best, but you can get bare root. Bare root not engrafted Fortunia rootstock, that's going to be the best. Can be tougher to grow, but Fortunia rootstock is going to help with that Florida tolerance. But not everything's going to be grafted. So give slightly more space to grow than usual, because a lot of these roses will focus on that root development, and you won't notice much of anything happening with them. So sometimes when those old garden roses, or a lot of plants will refer to sleep, creep, and leap. So you'll put something in the ground and it doesn't really do too much. You're not going to notice it make too many changes. It's going to look like it's just stuck, essentially. But over time, you'll they'll slowly start to grow, and then bam, one day it just looks like it's just going to explode in growth. So it's just going to be just important to know, make sure you give them that space. No matter how tempting it is, make sure you give them space and not to overcrowd them. So one question was, what about own root roses? So you can definitely plant some of your plants that aren't grafted onto Fortunia, which is, and they should do fine, but sometimes if we do have them that are grafted onto that different rootstock, you could have more success with them. So I wouldn't advise against it if it's not on that Fortunia, by all means. But it just kind of can give us a leg up in some of those planting. So, and plus, a lot of times when you go buy some of these plants or you find these roses, you may not have any information on the rootstock if it is grafted. We will see a lot of that with citrus plants. A lot of citrus will have their rootstock labeled just because, we're thinking a lot about disease resistance for things like citrus greening and canker, etc. But anyways, so it's not necessarily that you have to have it grafted. It can be its own roots. Plant at same depth in ground as it was in container. So protect that graft site. If you notice that graft site, so usually with that that graft site, you'll see where like the scion and the rootstock were put together. Usually, sometimes it'll swell around that union, that junction. So make sure that's not in the ground because that can actually cause rot to occur. And so it's best to try to plant at the same depth in the ground as it was in the container and make sure that graft isn't exposed. But sometimes you will see make sure that graft is slightly exposed, because you will sometimes see that if plants are up potted very quickly, they might get some extra soil in there, and then in the container, they too might be a little too deep. So just be aware of where that graft site is, and try to make sure that it's like at or just slightly above the soil surface. But usually, rule of thumb, if you're planting it at the same height or the same depth that it is in the container, you should be okay. And then you're going to want to make sure that you are going to irrigate regularly for the first 6 weeks as part of that establishment phase, so we can start to shoot its roots out into the soil. And for our climbing roses, you may need to have something to anchor it with. It can be like a bamboo, it can be trellis, or something to kind of help give it that support. So we talked a little bit about that maintenance and initial site selection, site preparation, and kind of that planting time. So now let's talk about the maintenance. So we're going to break down maintenance in these 5 major categories: irrigation, fertilization, mulching, weeding, grooming, and then pruning. Because again, with roses, pruning is intimidating. It's really intimidating. It's scary. It's so scary, but just because you feel like you're decimating your rose. But the reason we talk about that is because the best time to start our pruning is next month. But anyways, so let's talk about irrigation, fertilization, mulching, weeding, grooming, and pruning. So when we're talking about at least the pruning, I feel like the slides got out of order. We really want to think about where we actually prune. So when we actually prune, we want to kind of look for the bud on the rose, the stem. It's where we're going to start seeing where maybe a new leaf will come out, a new branch will come out, etc. So we actually want to cut just above the bud. And so this is right here on these little nodes that you can see, these little buds. Boop, boop, boop. So we want to actually have when we make this cut, we want to make sure the cut is is slanted away from the actual bud. So if any moisture falls on, it falls on the stem, it kind of moves away from the bud, not towards it. And we don't want to make it too sharp. We don't want to make it too flat. We want to make sure it's like just above the bud and slanted slightly away from the bud. So you can definitely see, like in image A, it's a flush cut that's too high above the bud. In image B, when you're pruning on that branch, it's just way too close to the bud. You want to give it a little bit of space. When in C, you don't want the slope cut. In image D, it's just too steep, and that's too much. It's too much of a space where it's just like just an open wound. So you want to try to limit that that open wound on the branch. And then if you have like dull pruning shears, etc., you want to make sure that you have they're sharpened so you have a really nice clean prune. Nothing is too jagged, because if that could end up holding moisture, and a lot of that moisture end up working its way into the trunk over time. So that best prune is going to be slightly above the bud and slightly angled away from the bud so moisture can roll off. But anyway, so that's just like a basic irrigation. Oh, here's a great question. Does it hurt the plant to remove prickles? If it doesn't, is there a tool to remove them? So honestly, I don't know that answer. I would err on the side of caution and do not remove prickles, just because a lot of those times, even if you remove a prickle, you're exposing the interior portion of the branch, which could end up being a way for diseases to enter into the actual plant. So we just kind of want to mitigate that as much as possible. So I don't know the answer, but I would tend to believe that we do not want to remove any of those prickles that grow on the rows. Great question. So I'll look into it to kind of just double check, but my inclination is no, you don't want to do it. And that it will hurt the rows. So, but I'll confirm. So thinking about irrigation, because roses are susceptible to black spot, which is a fungus, avoid any overhead irrigation. We should have zero overhead irrigation on any of our ornamental plants. Overhead irrigation should only exist on turf grass. So it's going to be best to try to use some micro irrigation on all of your roses, because you want to get the water just to the roots. You don't need it on the leaves. If the moisture sits on the leaves too long, that increases humidity around the plant, within the plant, and then it just leads to fungus outbreak. So you want to minimize that impact. So it's best to use micro irrigation and get that water down just on the roots of the plant. But if you do have rotors, because it's just what you have, make sure you're only irrigating in the morning, just because that'll allow excess water to kind of dry off throughout the day. So but the frequency can kind of change actually for how much we need to irrigate. For low maintenance roses like knockout roses, I see knockout roses all across Nassau County or Northeast Florida do horrible in the landscape, and a lot of times it's because they're actually being irrigated way too much. They look awful because they're just being irrigated so much. Once knockout roses or those low maintenance roses are established, only irrigate as needed, because they're typically drought tolerant and you don't really have to do much. Some of our higher maintenance roses, really think about at least once a week, minimum once a week, which still is not that much, but once a week. And that's assuming we're not getting here in Florida a lot of rain. So what is the difference if you use rotors or don't? So if you're using the rotors, make sure you're irrigating only in the morning to allow plants to dry out, and only irrigate as needed, or that minimum once a week. If you don't have any type of irrigation, you can still think about how just watering the plants. It might have to require a hose or something like that, but following these still following these same requirements would be best. So micro irrigation, if you do have an irrigation system, is the most preferred. So now let's talk a little about fertilization. And they're going to be slow release. And we do our applications typically monthly from mid-February through mid-November. So you're going to, with those applications starting next month, You are going to do those monthly applications mid-February to mid-November, and it's about 1 cup of that fertilizer per shrub per application, or half a cup twice a month. Usually you do those smaller applications for smaller shrubs or new shrubs that are recently planted in landscape. But if you do have some really small ones, you can actually spoon feed them, like just a little bit for smaller plants, just to and then also for like reduced amount for those low maintenance plants, it don't require nearly as much. But for a lot of those other roses that we're doing, that half a cup per shrub per application, or half a cup twice. So, but ultimately starting mid-February next month. So now thinking about mulch or weeding. So it's best to add or apply a 2 to 3 inch layer of mulch in all of your landscape beds. And roses are the same way. So apply that 2 to 3 inch layer of mulch, and then replace mulch as needed, because it's going to help naturally suppress a lot of the weeds that grow. It's going to help maintain soil moisture in an appropriate way, as well as it can help once it breaks down, it can build organic matter within the soil, which can help make your roses and other landscape plants be more successful. So selecting a mulch is going to be great. Avoid any cypress or cedar mulch. It's best to use like pine bark, pine straw, eucalyptus, melaleuca. You can use like a utility or yard waste mulch, but usually if our roses are going to be somewhere nice, we may not want to do the utility or yard waste. So I recommend like pine bark or pine needle. To me, that's the best, and that's the easiest, and it helps build soil acidity. And it's the cheapest too. All right, next, let's talk about grooming. So there is a lot of grooming that we do throughout the year as part of our pruning and structure support of the rows. So for grooming, for that row maintenance, we do a lot of this pruning, trimming the plants to help improve the health, make sure it has a good shape, and it can be productive. Sometimes if our roses have a lot of different branches and we're not doing that grooming and pruning of them throughout the season, or that heavy pruning once a year that we'll talk about, it ends up essentially the rose is trying to put all its resources in all these different branches. So therefore they're just kind of like, eh. So what we want to do is, as part of that grooming, helps direct nutrients to the healthy branches, helps direct those resources to the healthiest branches, and then it allows us to have more productive, better roses. But a lot of this is dependent on your expectations. Some gardeners will just like, I'll just do my once a year maintenance of pruning of my rose, and it's totally fine. But if you are doing if you're doing something that has like the competition that you want to show roses, you're going to do a lot more pruning and a lot more grooming, because you want to put all those resources into a couple of those very specific flower buds. So the one question that came in is into the chat box. We actually had 2. So slow release fertilizers have different time values. And some fertilizers can be slow release up to 1 year. Now for roses, that's not going to be needed. Usually the average time release for most of our slow release is going to be 60 to 90 days. 90 days is the most common one. So with those rose fertilizers, I believe it's typically a 60 day slow release. But yeah, once we select those are going to be time. And we usually don't see that 1 year time release unless we are going to a very specific seller, because usually you have to find those. But a general rose is going to have like 60 to 90 day time release associated with it. So it won't change the recommendations for fertilizer. And then the second question, since we're talking about grooming, is what's the difference between the pruning and the grooming? So great question. So essentially they're both the same thing, relatively. So pruning is we're going to talk about like that heavy pruning. So you're going to be cutting a lot of big branches. And think about grooming as kind of like little things, the little things that you're going to cut maybe throughout the year. So pruning can be heavy cuts. Grooming is just like the little touch-ups that you can do throughout the year. That's kind of how I always think of them in my head. But anyways, some of the grooming things that we can do throughout the year for rose maintenance is to think about deadheading, of course, because that can help proliferate more flowering, as well as it can keep, we want to keep the rose flowering, or any plant. It can help encourage it to keep flowering. You want to remove any suckers. So those suckers are anything that like pop up from the rootstock. They can be below ground. They can be above ground, just below the bud union, or where that graft site is. And you can actually see on the image some examples of some of these different types of suckers, just because they start to take a lot of energy. So we want to prune those out so they don't take energy away from the plant. And then we can also do any type of stem removal. So if there's any stems that end up growing in a way where they're crossing other branches or rubbing, we can go ahead and kind of groom by pruning those out, just because, again, they're not going to be healthy branches or stems. So those are some of the things that you can do throughout the year. So now let's talk about pruning. These are the big things. These are the big things that we do. Usually the rule of thumb is like you end up pruning around Valentine's Day, or just around the same time that azaleas start to bloom. So usually mid-February to early March. So once you start seeing those azaleas bloom, that's a really good indicator that, okay, now's the time to start doing my annual pruning of my roses, because it is recommended that if you want to have like really high quality roses, you come in once a year and do some pretty big pruning, and it's going to be different than your grooming that you might do throughout the year. So it's best to kind of prune with sterile, clean bypass blade pruning shears, a lopper, or even like a folding saw if it's a big one. But the biggest thing is you want to make sure they're sharp and clean, and making sure that you're sanitizing as well. So sharp to make sure that you're having a really good clean cuts, and that sanitation has helped prevent the spread of disease around the garden. So there's different types of prep that we can do. In that pruning is first, always remove dead wood first. Anything that's dead, go ahead and cut it out. Then go in and remove thin and weak growth. All right, so after you remove dead wood, then the thin and weak growth, then remove any crossing canes. So these are your major branches that now are going to be crossing and rubbing one another. You may want to remove one of them. What's the weakest of the two, or the one that you don't like of the two? Remove those, and then remove all leaves from rows and ground, and then kind of dispose. So you end up removing a lot of those leaves from what's left on the rows and on the ground, will help prevent the spread of disease into that next season, because a lot of our fungal pathogens will hang out on the soil. But anyways, remove all of that stuff, put it in a bag, toss it, throw it in the trash. Don't even compost it. So all of a sudden what we're doing is we're taking this rose that may have looked spectacular and beautiful, and all of a sudden just going to look like a couple twigs sticking up out of the ground. And that's okay. It's scary, but that's okay. So, when we think about shaping a rose, bud eyes point in direction of growth. So that image that I showed a little bit ago with that bud, the direction that bud is growing, that's the direction that rose wants to start growing on its new branch. So we can actually, thinking about that future growth, we can look at these stems that we still have left over and be like, okay, where do I need this rose to grow? You can find that bud. What direction is it growing? And it's like, okay, I like the direction that bud is going, so then I'll prune to that bud. But if I don't like that direction that the prune's growing, because maybe it's going to start shooting towards the interior of the rose, I'm going to say, okay, let me go down to the next bud. What direction is it growing in? And then I'll prune there. So what we want to do is kind of prune outwards to kind of promote a healthy round growth of the rose. And then height is just purely based off of prune to the height that you desire. So you can keep it up high, you can take it down low, but use those bud eyes on those branches to start reducing that cut and to help influence how it ends up growing in its shape that next season. So those little bud eyes, they allow us to essentially say, I want you to go this way and this way and this way and this way. So really looking at those remaining branches that you end up cutting in that mid-February to late March, investigate where those eyes are pointing or those buds, and allow that to determine where you're going to prune to. So bud eyes point in direction of growth. They so prune to outward facing bud eye to encourage around growth, and then the height just prune based off of your preferred desired height. So, but it's a little different than for some of our climbing roses. Never cut main canes. So and that's like the main vertical elements. You can trim lateral branching to encourage flowering, and then don't worry about bud eyes. So it's a little bit different. So now let's talk about a little about troubleshooting because we are getting low on time. So because this is a lot of the big issues that we have with roses. This is where we start to have people who are super encouraged about growing roses. They put them in the ground, and then after one season, they just throw their hands up in the air and say, "I give up." You know, just because we have things like this happen. So let's troubleshoot our roses because it can help with that management or prevention of a lot of the diseases. So to define our term, a pathogen is any organism such as a fungi, bacteria, it could be insects brought on by insects or viruses that spread diseases. Or any virus that can impact our plants. And some of the most common ones that we see that are fungal are powdery mildew and black spot. And black spot, that's the one I think that drives a lot of people crazy. So, and other things that we can see is Cercospora. So those are another fungal one. I'm going to go back here because some of the issues that we can see is black spot and Cercospora actually look very similar. So on the powdery mildew, it just looks like a powder that's kind of growing on the plant. And there are ways that we can manage it, fungicides, etc. But then the black spot, it creates essentially these black spots, these little fungal growth lesions on the plant. So they're just black spots. And one of the big differences that we see with black spot and Cercospora is you see Cercospora kind of looks more like it has a bullseye, that lighter area that's in the center of the spot. So you can see, again, black spot has a more uniform discoloration in its spotting, and Cercospora has a kind of little bullseye spot in the center of it. So some of the other things that we can see that impact our roses are going to be botrytis blight, which is a fungal pathogen. And we see this with not just roses, but we'll see things with like camellias that get this, downy mildew that you can see on the image on the right, kind of like this weird discoloration of a leaf. But like botrytis, that's one of those diseases that if it ends up on the ground in the soil, you have to clean it up because it can spread back to the plant in that next season. So dispose of a lot of these fungal pathogens, it's best to try to dispose of the infected material. Some things that we can also see is a crown gall, which is brought on by bacterial pathogens, or chili thrips, which kind of creates this weird mottled spotted pattern. That's a little insect that gets in. It can actually spread disease too, or introduce diseases to your roses. And then one of the big viruses that has an impact on roses is the rose mosaic virus. And it does kind of create a really cool looking pattern, but it's an unfortunate thing that if you have rose mosaic virus, there's nothing you can do about it. It's just you have to dispose of it to help prevent it from spreading. So another common one that we're really starting to see more and more of is rose rosette virus. It does impact knockout roses. It's spread by a tiny little mite, but you end up seeing things that like the branches are twisted leaves, like witch's broom, a proliferation of prickles along the stems, yellowing leaves, and then it ends up killing the plant. And again, there's no cure for this. This is you dispose of this plant. So when we're thinking about some of these diseases, so I'll go back to like black spot. So a lot of these fungal diseases, we can actually help kind of manage a little bit by a lot of times you just find fungicides that are labeled for black spot, powdery mildew, and a lot of these Cercospora that impact our roses. But it's going to be important that a lot of times it's prevention. You have to put these down to try to prevent a lot of these diseases from happening. A lot of the people that are showing roses competitively are applying a fungicide almost on a weekly basis. Now, does regular homeowners doing that are doing non-competitive roses? No, absolutely not. But it's important to know that with roses, typically you're going to have a fungicide maintenance protocol throughout that season of growing. And I'll make sure I send that to you all as part of our documents that we have. But it's important to know that with roses, you're going to have to manage for fungus. And it's pretty common to find fungicides for roses that's labeled for a lot of these diseases. And as well as always trying to monitor for different insects like thrips. You can see them. They're tiny. It's harder to see mites, but you can try to scout regularly to see if there's any insects that could be causing damage to your roses and then manage them then. That's going to be best. So scout regularly to prevent the amount of pesticides or insecticides that would need to be used for your roses or anything in your garden. But some of these diseases like this rose mosaic or the rose rosette virus, a lot of times there's nothing you can do about it, which is unfortunate. And but a lot of times we end up spreading a lot of these diseases ourselves. So poor irrigation practices, like overhead irrigation, can spread fungus from shrub to shrub pretty quickly. If we prune one infected plant and move to another infected plant, we can spread a virus or a bacteria or a fungus from one plant to another with our hands, our tools, etc. So it's always best to make sure that with your roses, you are scouting regularly. So just looking for issues that are going to occur. Follow any type of best management practice, but sanitize your tools. Sanitize, wash your hands, sanitize your tools, manage your roses properly, but also make sure that you are not spreading those diseases as well. So, and we will send out some more information. There's a really cool website through IFAS that we have about that best way to selection, sharpening, overall care. But ultimately, make sure that you enjoy the roses. Is it always going to work? No. Are some things going to look well? Absolutely. Some things won't. But it's all part of that trial and error. But having these tools and at least this recommendation for basic management practices will go a long way in the best management of those roses. So make sure you enjoy them. You know, the Babs put in this program into this PowerPoint, you know, some of the poets, which makes sense for Babs, which is awesome. But they had it right. You know, William Shakespeare and two noble kinsmen, of all flowers, methinks the rose is best. James Joyce and Ulysses wrote, I love to have the whole place swimming in roses. And Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of my favorites, said, there is simply the rose. It is perfect every moment of its existence, whether good or bad. But anyways, so make sure you just enjoy your roses. Plant them, try them out. I encourage you to do so because of their, you know, what they provide to our garden, the aesthetic. But anyways, here's our contact information. You can always, we have our two offices, like you all, probably most of you all know. Our main office is in Yulee on Minor Road. And we also have an office out in Callahan. We have our website, and you can always send any of your questions to our Master Gardener Volunteer Help Desk, or just give our office a phone call. You can follow us on Facebook. We have our YouTube channel, Instagram, and I have started a new podcast. So it's like, I'm sorry, I'm just going to inundate you all with as much information as possible. That's my job and my goal. But anyways, feel free to reach out to us at any time. I would appreciate your questions. And as always, we'll follow up with additional resources and information to this presentation today. And again, you know, because I don't anticipate or expect you all to remember every single thing that I said, but my goal is to at least make you all aware that we do have these resources and that you can reach out to our office to help answer or troubleshoot any of these questions or problems that you may have in your garden or your landscape. Roses or not, it doesn't matter what it is. But anyways, thank you all so much. And I will, if any of you all have any questions or anything like that, feel free to ask those. So, and I'll make sure I look back at some of the questions that I didn't miss any that were put into the chat box already earlier. Oh, here's one. So What's recommended for sanitizing tools? So there's a couple ways that you can sanitize tools. Isopropyl alcohol always works great. Ideally, you actually set it in the isopropyl alcohol and kind of like let it soak for a little bit. Having like a dip where you just dunk pruning shears into isopropyl alcohol will work fine as well. Some people use like those bleach wipes, that works really well. The only concern that we do have with bleach isn't necessarily it's what it can do is it can corrode the blades quicker on your tools, so you'll notice that they can dull a little bit quicker, so you may have to sharpen them more frequently if you're using bleach. This is a really good question. Would watering with reclaimed water affect whether the plants are susceptible to viruses, bacteria, etc.? I don't know. I don't know. I would think not. The only thing that I would say is like with reclaimed water, or just with treated water, a lot of that water has a lot of the like it has a higher pH. Sometimes there's a concern that the pH with our treated water or reclaimed water can have an impact on it. And then sometimes I have to double check. You can actually, depending on who your water utility provider is, you can actually go onto their webpage and pull up their annual water reports. You can pull up the water reports to kind of see what are the conditions of the water, because sometimes there are salts within the reclaimed. Now, minor, where it's not typically a concern, but just something that it could be worth looking at. So the only thing that I could imagine is the water in itself doesn't make the plants more susceptible. It's just maybe if that water, depending on how it is managed or treated, it could end up creating something within the soil sphere that ends up making that environment less happy for the rose, which could then lead to it being stressed and be more susceptible to those viruses, bacteria. But I'm interested. I'll look more into that. So well water is totally okay. Yeah, totally okay. So usually our water is totally fine and non-concern. So, and we will be having our Master Gardener volunteer meeting after this. I know a lot of Master Gardener volunteers are on here. So at that time, I'll make sure I allow for the security to kind of change to allow Master Gardeners to be able to speak, etc. Anyways, but it's a great question. All right. Are there any more questions from anybody in the meeting space? All right, perfect. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. I appreciate your time. And feel free to reach out to us. I'll send out a follow-up email to everyone that's registered for today's event, just so you can get a copy of the presentation, a link to the video that's recorded, as well as some additional resources from the University of Florida. All right. Thank you, everybody. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.